little bit. I will do that later. I'll go on tangents later. But all over this world, there's many migration stories. In fact, there's migration stories that are even happening today, as we speak and watch the news and see history going on in the present. And so I wanted to start kind of at the beginning of what I know about the Anishinaabe migration to where the food grows on the water. And the migration story I'm going to start with is called the Wallab Olive. Now, not too many folks are familiar with the Wallab Olive, but it's an oral history that was kept by the Lenape, or the tribes out on the East Coast, like the Abenakis and that. But anyways, the Wallab Olive is kind of, it's a story that is a little bit, what shall I say? They're still discussing whether they think this is a true story or not. But anyways, the Wallab Olive starts out, and it's a 3,000-year migration of a people that comes from the Bering Strait. And then they came down into into the continental America. And the story goes that when they came down and they got into on the eastern side of the Rockies and that, and what they talk about is what there were already people here when this migration came through. And so they talk about meeting these different people on their way as they migrate east till they get all the way to the East Coast. And so they, some of the history talks about how they had to stop along the way and stay for a while in different areas as they migrated, and they met different peoples. And one of the big conflicts they had was, well, what I'm going to estimate that it might have been crossing the Mississippi, because they came to this huge river and there were people living there, and they asked if they could come across. And then the people said, no, you can't come across. So he had to stop there, and he had to stop there for 4 generations while they gathered their strength and food to get across and past those people. And they had a war with those folks for like 4 generations. And they hypothesized that that was probably the mound builders. And they fought these people and pretty much wiped them out. And they kept going towards the east until they came to the land where the sun comes up, or the East Coast, where they settled for millennia and were prosperous, had beautiful homes, everything was nice, and there was peace, and they spread all along the East Coast all the way up. But then while there was 7 prophets, and they call them prophets the 7 fires. And these prophets came and they told the people about, the first prophet came and he talked to the people about the Madewin Lodge and all of the knowledge that was given to create a healthy and everlasting life. And so in the first fire, that first prophet gave all of that knowledge to the people. And then the second fire, the second prophet said that over time, folks will forget some of this teachings and they'll kind of fall away, and Medea will kind of diminish in strength, but a young boy will be born and he will find the knowledge and help the tribes come back to their way. And then the third prophet came and told them that there was a chosen ground in the west, and that they should go to this place and they must move their families to where that food grows on the water. And then the third prophet said that the Anishinaabe will find a path to their chosen ground in the land to the west. And the fourth fire was given by two prophets. And they had two different prophecies. And it was a prophecy about a light-skinned people are going to be coming to your land. And you have to watch what his face looks like. That first prophet said, "Oh, if that light-skinned people come and they show you the face of brotherhood, their knowledge and your knowledge and the knowledge of two other peoples, four peoples will come together with all that knowledge to be able to live in peace." And the other prophet said that if that light-skinned person comes and he doesn't show brotherhood, he'll be bringing some bad times to the people. He said, you must be careful because the face of the brotherhood and the face of death look the same. So they're not easy to tell apart. And so that was one of the reasons why they needed to move. And the fifth prophet said that the fire will come at a time, the fifth fire will come at a time of great struggle. And it will grip all the lives of all of the nations. And people for many nations will be under the influence of the bad promises. And the prophet of the sixth fire said it is evident that the promises of the fifth fire came in a false way, because it wasn't, the light-skinned folks did not come in brotherhood. And so times got bad and there was a lot of sickness. And so that's why they were told that you have to move to where the food grows on the water. Move to where the food grows on the water. But some people chose to stay behind and didn't believe these prophets. And those tribes that stayed way behind were the ones that had to experience all of the sickness and the pandemics that came over the ocean with them light-skinned people. And during the sixth fire, the prophet said that the children were going to be taken away from the elders and the teachings will be forgotten. And you can tell some of them things came to pass with like boarding schools where children were taken away and the language was lost, and the Medewan religion, the sacred Migas, was not seen for a while. And they were told that, again, someday a little boy will, they hid all of their birch bark scrolls and all their knowledge. And the prophecy was that someday a little boy will come and he will help find all of that knowledge that was hidden away and bring it back to the people. And the seventh prophet came to long ago, and he said he was different from the other ones. He was young and he had a strange light in his eyes. And he said that on the seventh, in the last fire, new people will emerge. And all of the knowledge and strength and traditions in our culture will come back to us. And so a lot of times, folks, Anishinaabe folks we talk about this being the time of the seventh fire now. Because our culture and language is coming back. And these prophecies pretty much predicted what was going on here in America at the time. So the seven fires is the prophecy of our migration from the East Coast, following along where the food grows on water. And then along that trail of moving to where the food grows on water, the predictions were there will be 7 stops along the way. And after the first stop, they looked for an island, kind of shaped like a turtle. And they couldn't find it or really figure out where that was. But then this lady who was pregnant had a dream about standing on a turtle. And so she brought that, her and her husband brought that dream to the elders, and they discussed it and decided where that first island was. It was probably by about Montreal. And then they proceeded over time. They're kind of guesstimating that maybe it took like 500 years for this migration, maybe a little longer. Might have been 1,000 years.
1,000
years. So they followed along pretty much the St. Lawrence Seaway. I brought a map. I'll try to stick it up here on the camera a little bit, showing some of that migration trail. Maybe Margaret can hold it up. You can kind of see where the Great Water and where the stops were. And by the time that we first met well, actually, before we got to about the 5th stop, they had conflict with, folks that had lived along some of these other stops. And so we had a lot of battles with the Iroquois Confederacy and those tribes. And once we got past that, they went on to kind of over by the Detroit area. And then they had conflict with Sauk and Fox. And by the time, that's probably good enough. And by the time we got to Bawating, or what's known as, what do they call Bawating in English? Is it not Sault Ste. Marie?
Yeah.
So when we got to about Sault Ste. Marie, that was about the time when the fur trade and the Europeans caught up to where we were, and you started seeing the Anishinaabe more in written history. And then when they got to Bawating, some of the tribe went to the north around Lake Superior, and some of the tribe went around south shore of Lake Superior. And again, that took many generations. And one of the stories I heard was that when we finally met up, when all of the folks who migrated on the north side of the lake and the south side of the lake, when we met up again, we knew we were the same people because we still had the same songs. So we were still singing the same songs, and we met, and this site here, Spirit Island in the estuary, was that 6th stopping place. Now they say to look for an island shaped like a turtle. But what does a turtle look like? What does he look like when he's in the water? He could just have his head up, or he could have some of his shell up. It doesn't mean he's just going to be perfectly round with 5 legs and that sticking out. But if you kind of look at Spirit Island today, it actually kind of looks like a turtle that's kind of half out the water, especially if you kind of look at it from an aerial view. You can see that the land on that island goes up like that turtle's head. And if you look around, you can see it looks like his shell is still in the water, and just some of his head and part of his back is up. So they didn't really live on these turtle islands, they live on, next to them. And so that's where Spirit Island came into this migration story. When they got to here, the bay here, there was like a cornucopia of food. There was deer and wild rice, elk and moose on the hillside, thousands of wild fowl. Lake Superior Estuarium here isn't it one of the largest walleye spawning grounds in the world? So it was a beautiful place to live. And so they settled here. But then some of them went back to the 7th stopping place, which was Wanakoning or Madeline Island. And that was where the final stop of the Anishinaabe in their migration to where the food grows on water. And then there's stories too now. So that's kind of the migration, but then we got stories, a little more local ones, like the story of Biaswa, as he moved from Madeline Island coming towards this way. And then there's the history of the first Anishinaabe person to live here would have been on the Wisconsin Point. And his name was Wamagisigo, or they called him the Big Martin. And so he was the person who established this site for settling for the Anishinaabe people. And 3 of our chiefs were the direct descendants of him. There was Shingub and Naganab and another one. And so those are still family names that you'll see up on Fond du Lac here. So we're kind of up to the present day. But I kind of look and I research on some of our Meday scrolls and to talk about the migration moving here was done under the guidance of the knowledge of our spiritual knowledge. And each one of them stops, they'd have their medicine lodges and all their ceremonies. So that was done here a lot too. But if you keep looking at some of our migration scrolls, once they got to here, we didn't really stop here. We kept going. We went up St. Louis River, up Fond du Lac, and they kept searching for Anishinaabe people to bring the enlightening of the Meday religion. And so some of our migration scrolls go all the way up to St. Louis. And when you get to, a lot of people know that, but when you get to Floodwood, there's a portage down the Savannah River over into Sandy Lake area, which is in the Mississippi watershed. So that was a that was a very well-known old trail from the Mississippi watershed over into Lake Superior watershed or back. So some of our scrolls keep that migration going all the way up till they reach Leech Lake, where they bring bring our Meday religion, and the scrolls go all the way up to Red Lake. So we have historical documents documenting this whole historical migration up to out as far as they could take the water. And so that's how far that the historical scrolls go right now, is all the way up to Red Lake.
You want me to add?
Yeah, Marvin can add a little more details there if you'd like.
I'll be great. It was really good story, good explanation of certainly the migration. Do that. Marvin DePaul, I live on south shore of Lake Superior. You go from here about 50 miles, keep going that way. That's where I live, Red Cliff. Our tribe, I lived there. My Tsunami name, Chippewa Benes. That's with the sound coming off the wings of the thunderbird. My clan is Gitain the Man, old time sturgeon. Sturgeon, that's why I have a sturgeon on my medallion. That's my family. That's my family. And go around Tsunami country, anybody who belongs to the fish clan, like my family, brother and sister. There's other clans certainly that we have. But our clan, you talk about the migration and certainly the how we got here. Our clans, families came with us too. Our history. Our chiefs also came with us too, the old time way. But I'd like to go back a little further. There was a time here amongst this lake and the other lakes that Chigamic, that's what we call that lake, Chigamic. Big water, big place. And there was a time here that Lake Superior, Michigan, Europe, all the bodies of water, one lake. At one time, she may was young, long time ago. There used to be a time here also that there's probably there's ice that went up to the sky. Ice. No Tsunami could live here. Now that's way before the migration I'm talking, way before that. But but there's a time here that's how this water was. They say that this water, you could go back 20 miles from Lake Superior, that was the shoreline. That's what they say. And certainly Jeff indicated some of the written documentation, certainly written. We never had books. She made was out years ago.
No, I was gonna bring birch bark, but
Right. We've had stories. That's how our school was. I like to call it Conditionology school. That was our school. We told stories, we taught, just like we're doing here, telling the stories, we're teaching, telling the stories. But back at that time when all that water was like that, it kind of receded. There's a place where I live, at I mean, you can learn a lot from our Tsunami language about the land, just if you interpret it. You can really learn a lot about history if you really go into the language. But there's a place over by us, by Ashland, that bay over there, they call it Shawamigan Bay. Remember years ago, I thought, when the heck did they come up with that word Shawamigan? But I don't know, I went to Bad River and asked them over there. And my good friend Tony, how come they call that bay Shawamigan? He said, I don't know that. She warm again, she cold again, she warm again. I said, no. You were just kidding. You were just kidding. Why? How can you call that bay? But in that bay, you know, a lot of times you'll find place names around the area. It sounds Tsunami. Some of them are, but it gets twisted around with the English, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Kind of gets twisted around.
They
so-
can't move their lips as good.
Yeah. But at that place in our language, it's called Ja Amik, Amikun. Ja Soft Beaver. Yeah, Amik is beaver. Soft beaver dam. They say in our legends, and there's even legends and stories about that. We'll be here all night if you keep going on that, but in our legends, there's stories about giant beaver, Mick. Giant beaver, one of our spiritual heroes, will tell you a story about how he created, made different things. But at that time, they say there was giant beaver that swam in these waters. To our oral tradition, where you say that, there is never giant beaver. Well, ask the scientist. Ask the scientist, was there ever a giant beaver in Lake Superior, prehistoric beaver? That's what they say. What's the answer? You already know. Yeah, right. Right. So how in the heck did the tsunami know that? How did they know that? So what that tells me that the tsunami existed on this land when those prehistoric, those giant beavers existed. Because we have stories, we have legends about them. There's stories about, you mentioned turtle. Stories about that turtle. Jeff shared with you a little bit about that. So I talked to the elders here in Redcliffe few years ago, some of the elders remembering how far back in the stories that could be told right here. They knew what they were taught, they could go back 15,000 years. We sat down, that's how old some of the stories are. That knowledge that is shared with you here, yeah, it could be around that time too. It could be. But what I'm saying is as like today, this earth is changing, right? It's changing. We don't have that iceberg here right now. It changed. The earth way back then, when the tsunami, when you only seen indigenous footprints on this land.
Yeah, they.
You know, that's what Jeff said, the footprint. So there's footprint on this land that goes all the way out from the east, all the way to here. And it didn't happen overnight. No, it didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen in 100 years, generations and generations. But if you go way back further, there's a place, there's an old man. His name was Mike Bearhart, good friend of mine from St. Croix. He's alive today, he's probably 130. You know, he was like, I remember talking to him about this place right. I remember asking him, I want him to name all of the places that he went racing at. That's what I'm trying to get out of him. All the places, he told me. I used to go here, put my mind on, went all the way from down there, Yellow River, he named all these places. The last place that he told me about was right here. Right here, right out there, right out there. He said they used to go out there and camp out there. He lived there for a month. He said it was just loaded. Wild rice. Can you imagine that? Just loaded. So I went every place that he told me to go, I went. In fact, I even took my canoe. I went down Moccasin Mike Road, went way the heck down there and looked out there. And it's, right now I see with old cattails and boats running around them. But I started to imagine what our ancestors, what the old people, what this earth, what it looked like. That whole filled up with wild rice. I don't know what Jeff would he indicate, but he shared with us how it might have looked. I have a hard time even imagining that. Even imagining it. There's a place, I work Tipple. Tipple, that's my job. Part of the job is to work with archaeologists, work with traditional people who have that knowledge. So kind of go like this, like that, and I come up with a word. And I came up with a word, and I call it conditionology. Conditionology. And what I'm finding more and more, is the science of things and the Anishinaabe of things. They call it TK.
Tech.
Yeah, TK, traditional ecological knowledge. And I'm finding that more and more like this, coming together, more and more. It's like, man, I'll come up with a word, missionology. Missionology, what are some of the, here's an example that I like to give. Every spring when the snow leaves behind my house, I wait till the Omakaki, the frog. Omakaki, that's how we say frog when he starts chirping. There's legend stories about that Omakaki when it starts chirping, what starts spawning? Walleye. All right. So I listen to that frog. I tell you what, that frog is, how does he know that? He starts chirping and it reaches a certain pitch, and I learned to listen to that pitch. That lake, an hour away from walleye spawning there. I don't know, he must have ESPN or something. How does that frog know it? But it does. So there's certain things with that. But way back in time, there's a place in Red Cliff also that we discovered in Red Cliff of indigenous, I don't know, artifacts, I guess, evidence there. And we dated some of that charcoal that's there 5,350 years ago.
Thank you.
Right there in Red Cliff, right on Lake Superior. 5,300 some years ago. There's another date was 3,200 years ago. The most recent one was 1,300 years ago. Different dates of indigenous occupation, of this land. I mean, years ago, there was never a calendar like you have today. You just go you went by the moon. You went by the moon, but one thing where I get confused with is our traditional calendar, we have 13 moons. You go by that calendar hanging on the wall, how many is there? All right, there's 12. Right. So, throughout all this, I just wanted to give you just a little bit about way back with that. And last night I got a call. And I look at it like this also. That, yes, indigenous, we have our footprints on this land. Thousands of years we've had marking. And the stories that Jeff has indicated, there's teaching that we follow. It's guiding principles. Really take care of that land, take care of the medicines, the fish. There's certain ways that we conduct yourself. But I've come to find out in my young old age. It wouldn't happen. I come to find out, talking to different people throughout the world, that there was a time, I don't know if it was 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 years ago, whatever you want to call it, that all people, I don't care what race you were, if all people had a connection to the earth, all people. I went to Germany one time and I really wanted to go to the Black Forest. I went to the Black Forest. There's an old man there, and started visiting him, and you go in his house and he had like those old mason jars, all different kind of medicine in his house in that jar. And I started talking to him. He even had like a little drum. Started talking to him. Holy crazy! I could relate to you. Starting to talk almost like a Tsunami, relating to the earth and stuff, But he said, we kind of got away from that. I think that's what he said. He talked about legends and stories that they had in the Black Forest. It was really interesting, So what I'm saying is, all people here have a connection, certainly to the earth. That's why I like this place. That provides the opportunity to have these types of discussions. And with that, so that's just a little bit I want to contribute to the story. Now, I could go way back further yet. We could, there are stories, but I'm gonna leave it at that for now. Which,
Yeah, one of the names for this Duluth area is Misawa Kong, which is land of the giants. And that's because of when they came here, they seen them giant beavers and other large animals like that. But what I'm going to talk a little bit now is my own personal experiences and in my life learning about Spirit Island. When I was a little guy, like 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, I was a nosy little guy. And I was at family feasts and that, I always hung around the old guys and listened to them. And one of the main concerns in the history on Fond du Lac was where our reservation is today, up over the portage. And that's a place we call Bapaskamamitagong. We don't call its name is not Nagaji Wanong or Fond du Lac. That's down here at the west end of the estuary where the rapids start. And the story I heard was that the reservation, now this is my elders talking when I was a little boy, and what really struck me was all they ever talked about was our treaties and these issues of the shape of the reservation and where it was supposed to start. And it always really struck me. That's why I always paid attention about the treaties. And listening to them elders talk about the contested shape of the Fond du Lac Reservation and where it was supposed to start. One little old white-haired man always kept saying, and our reservation was supposed to start at Spirit Island. And that's the first I can remember hearing about Spirit Island. It was such an important site that that's where they wanted the reservation to start in our oral history. Of course, it isn't that way today. But Papaska now I heard two origin stories as a young person. And one was that the reservation southeast corner was supposed to start at an island in the river with no trees. And they said the reason there was no trees on that island is because the mist from the rapid would come up and ice all of the branches and break them off, and trees couldn't grow there. And the other story was that when we finally moved up here, up to where Fond du Lac is today, when they moved up there, all the timber had been stolen, and it looked like a bare area in the middle of the forest, like a bald island. So those are the two stories I always heard about why our reservation is where it is today. So what they wished for and what we got are two really different things. But I'm 71 now. And if we go back to that food that grows on the water, I've been at them rice lakes since I can remember, even as a little boy standing on shore while grandma, grandpa, mom, and dad, aunties, uncles are all out harvesting rice. So it's been a big part of my life for 71 years. It's such a big part of our life that my family has, and my little brother has built a wild rice processing plant. And we harvest or process large amounts of wild rice for the people. So it's something that is in my everyday life. It's been very important to us. It's important due to our migration stories. And one of them shores that I stood on as a little boy and watched my grandpa, and I can't even remember who he was racing with. They were racing out here on the estuary. You know, I can remember as a young boy, you know where the Oliver Bridge is? Well, if you cross that Oliver Bridge and in the fall you looked towards the lake, that whole estuary used to be covered in wild rice. I can remember that.
Yeah.
I can remember dozens of boats out there harvesting down here in Duluth. Cars would land up, park up at the Boy Scout landing and start from there and race all the way to Spirit Island. I go over to Oliver Bridge nowadays, there's nothing.
Right.
It's just nothing but open water. What happened there?
Yeah.
Again, that goes back to our migration story and our little brother who came over here from across the ocean, not taking care of things like he should. One elder told me one time in one of our traditional speeches, he kept talking about our little brother. My little brother, he was talking about the folks from across the ocean. He said they're like a little kid here. They're new here and they're young, and you know how little kids are, they're rammy, they wreck stuff. Well, until our little brothers ancestors make up the soil and the earth here, they're not going to respect it because they're not part of it yet. And they weren't listening to us on how you're supposed to live here over on this continent. So those are some of the things that I've heard over the years and that I've seen over the years. I've seen a lot of wild rice disappear. I've seen it disappear from other lakes too. Some of it's caused by, pollution. A lot of times back in the 60s and 70s, over harvesting. Not good management. DNR still doesn't manage the wild rice properly. And so that's a big concern. Okay, like Marvin was saying, we're just young elders yet, so listening to the old guys. And they're worried, my grandchildren aren't going to have no wild rice. And they're really, it's really disturbing to them. And it's getting that way for me too. As I'm starting to get towards old age. And I've seen that wild rice disappear right out of this estuary here. Where are my grandchildren going to rise? Your Cloquet River system. Rice Lake, Fish Lake, Boulder Lake, Island Lake, all used to be big wild rice beds. And they have Paleo-Indian campsites. So people have been camping and ricing up along that area for over 7,000 years. The university has one archaeological site on Boulder Lake that's over 7,000 years old. And even out on our reservation, on one of our rice lakes, they've done them core samples. And they found wild rice pollen from 3,000 years ago on that lake. So that lake we've been caretakers of that lake and that rice there for 3,000 years. And so that's some of what I've seen in my lifetime. And now I'm going off on a tangent now. And we're talking about treaty rights. But when you come up to my museum as a non-Indigenous person, I usually ask you if you know what your treaty rights are. Because you guys have treaty rights too. But sometimes little boys have real short memories and they forget about that. And do you know what one of your most important treaty rights are in this area? The non-Indian treaty right? It's called iron ore. In the 1825 Treaty of Prairie du Chien, which came up to Fond du Lac, and the Treaty of 1826 is called the Mineral Treaty or the Timber Treaty. And in that treaty, it states, and I'm going to quote it, the Indians grant the right to the US government to carry away the minerals. So every mining job for the last 150 years is a treaty right job. And those kind of things can't be forgotten. And they should be remembered more in mainstream history. Another example, right up again at Nagatiwanan is their cemetery that got destroyed. That cemetery was disturbed over 3 times. So 3 times they forgot. Well, the first time they didn't forget, it was intentional. But they came through and put Highway 23 there and disturbed it. Then they came through again, in the last few years and disturbed it again. How would MnDOT not know that hasn't been a cemetery there for like 400 years? How can they forget that history? And forgetting that history on the other side, kind of hurts my heart too, because then you guys aren't allowed the knowledge and your treaty rights and what both sides got out of that treaty. And part of that treaty was to take care of the land and to take care of the wild rice. The mining is not more important than the wild rice. It's not less important, but they're both important enough that they should be taken care of. And unfortunately, through my life, I've seen that disappearing. And a lot of that is because history gets forgotten. I made a saying the other week that if you want to raise lawyers and doctors and presidents and Indian chiefs, turn off the internet. Otherwise, you're not going to be raising knowledgeable, fit human beings to take care of these treaty rights that we both share. And that's kind of one of the reasons I came and wanted to talk about the estuary, because of what I've seen disappear just in my lifetime and how serious that is in our culture and in your culture. Because then you guys don't have access to that good food either. Because everything that we had on this planet or this continent, we had no problem sharing with a little boy or little brother. I don't know, you want to say something next, Marv?
Well, no, I'm enjoying listening to you. Yeah, you're right on. You only got, I suppose, a little time left.
Oh,
here.
yeah, a little time. I think there's probably some folks who want to ask you guys some questions, that's up to you.
That's what I was gonna suggest.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
When I say at the museum, if I can't answer your question, I'll make one up. So feel free to ask.
Anybody have questions or? Yeah.
Isn't there a story of your people with the wolf and like the wolf and the Lake Spirit looking like the head of a wolf and wolf being part of your story? Or am I wrong?
Yeah,
I can't hear what you
Well,
said.
She's asking if there's wolf stories that have to do with.
there are stories,
Yeah.
stories of the mine gun as we say.
Yeah.
Right, the mine gun, Jordan, is that the mine gun is the Tsunami, the brother. The stories with it, relationship that we have throughout even during the time of creation. Creation where the mine gun walked with the Anishinaabe on this earth here. And at one time then they finally separated, but they said what happened to the mine gun will happen to the Anishinaabe.
Yeah.
Right, there's a very close kinship that we have with the Mayengan. Because what happens to the Anishinaabe happens to the Mayengan. And for those of us who knows what a brother is, your brother. I don't know how to explain it, but you, Zangyawen, you love your family. You love your sister, you love your brother. That's how we look at that Mayengan. For those of us who put that practice. But without going too much into it, there's a lot more certainly to that. But that's a good question.
You talk about wild rice disappearing. I grew up in Superior in the 50s, and I do remember some of those by the Bridge. How much of an impact do you think the dams in St. Louis River changed the lay of the land downriver, even into this estuary, impacted that lot?
Did you get the question? Yeah.
No, I'm hard of hearing. I'm just.
Yeah.
Yes, if the dams, if you think the dams affected the rice beds.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It doesn't have the up and down flow anymore to help turn the bottom of the river a little bit, turn them seeds up. One of the ways that they used to try to get the rice to re-sprout like that is drag stuff across the bottom of the water. And that would have been kind of imitating the spring floods and things. And the dams kind of stopped that. Plus it stopped the sturgeon run and the fish runs from going up the rapids farther up the river also. My grandpa's older brother talked about lassoing sturgeon up on the upper St. Louis. They get them sturgeon to kind of go through a loop and then they yank on the tail and take a few guys to be able to pull one of them in.
Oh,
So we still have stories, oral history on before the dams were up.
Otter Island and Spirit Island and larger for the dams?
I'm not sure, of the size of what Spirit Island was 500 years ago.
Just wondering what impact that had. If it changed the flow and the amount of water that routinely came down with the season versus now they control it, how much water comes downstream the dam. So whether Coal Island was really not an island at the time.
Yeah, geology changed over time. None of them turtle islands were symbolic. They didn't, like I said, right now, if you take a look at Spirit Island, it looks just like a turtle that's just coming out of the water a little bit. And the shell's just right under the water. I really think that island was bigger. It probably had trees on it in the past. And I'm sure that there was a lot of occupation on the larger islands. And going back to another story on the reservation. Now I have the Indian agent's report on the shape change of the reservation on the museum website. If you go to fdlrez.com and go to museum pages, you can see the government slanted view of the shape change of the reservation. But one of the chiefs in there stated that he wanted the southeast corner of the reservation to be on the two islands where they used to garden. So I'm not sure which two islands those were, but they had to be big enough for people to garden on.
Oh, yeah.
That's what I'm thinking. Because like that one elder said, he wanted the reservation to start by Spirit Island.
There's a question that came in on the chat about, and that probably some of that might be a good question for resource management folks, but about purchasing Spirit Island and the restoration plans out there. And also there's a lot of beaver out there right now. They're building a little dam off that. That's kind of an aside.
Well, Marvin talked about that giant beaver. There's also the stories of a large beaver dam that the bear broke through to get farther up the shore. Now, it might have been symbolic about the migration going north, but they talked about some big giant beaver dams. And when your beavers are this big, just think of the size of the dam. So there's a lot of oral history about way back there that, but what I was going to mention too, okay, we'll talk about the 1854 treaty. Well, my grandpa was born in like 1898, and his older brother was born in 1888. So their mother was probably born around 1860 or maybe a little earlier. So my great grandparents were the children of the people who sat there and signed them treaties. And so that direct oral history from them people who lived down here on the Gajiwanong before we moved up there are still fresh in our minds. That's only 150, 170 years. And so I can still be connected to the words. So my grandpa told me that he heard from his grandpa who lived down here when the treaties were signed. So a lot of the oral history and what I heard as a young fellow came directly from the children and the grandchildren of the treaty signers. And their concern over where the reservation was supposed to start. And like I said, when I was a little guy, that's all they talked about. I could never figure out, well, why they only talk about this one thing. Well, they weren't talking about one thing, they were talking about everything, our lives. And then that wild rice. So a lot of these things that we hear and we talk about oral history is as valid as written history. And a lot of people can't understand how far back in time you can go. You can probably have family stories that your great grandparents told you, or even your great grandparents. You might have family stories of your great grandparents moving here, into this area or coming across the ocean. That's oral history, and it can be years and years old. Oral history goes all the way back to the Pilgrims, in mainstream history. You can still hear stories from ladies of, again, what they're called ladies who are descendants of the people from Mayflower. So oral history can really go back a long way. And that's kind of what we came to talk a little bit about here tonight. Let you know a little more about this area, what I've seen over my lifetime. And then we sent all of the crazy characters and that up to Red Cliff. We sent them back to that cemetery.
Sometimes they sneak back, don't they?
Yeah.
I'd be curious to know what spiritual significance,
My what?
what spiritual significance the island has for you today. Spirit Island.
Well, that was one of the sites where they say that the McGee's came out of the water and brought us all of the religions and traditions we practice today. And usually what we hear is that what you're supposed to do is lead a healthy, happy, long life. And most of our ceremonies and spiritual, I don't know what you want to call them, spiritual teachings, or how to lead a good life so that you live a long, healthy, happy life. So that's basically just like the 10 Commandments. 8 or 9 of them are pretty good. And most of your religions teach you how to live a good life. And that's kind of, the basis of most religions, spirituality, is just how to live and be a good person. Have a strong family. You gotta have strong families nowadays to fight a lot of the temptations that are out there. And that's kind of basically, without going into details, of how to lead a good life and to be a good role model in your community. And so that's what I try to do.
we'll leave it there. I folks have questions, come on up, but I just really appreciate you guys folks sharing with us tonight and helping me think about the whole shore all the way down, Strong Bay and back and up the estuary and all the way to Red Lake, how connected we all are around here. So thank you much for coming down and.
Yeah, I tricked Marvin into coming down because I knew he could really add a lot.
Thanks to all you folks who came online too. It's nice to see so many people on there. Appreciate it.
Right, that need.
We send it down.
We set it up.
Much, y'all.
Be good.
Good. You go up, man.
Oh, boy, I don't know. I don't think.
Actually, second.